On 17 October, one of the thousands of rockets that Hamas has indiscriminately launched toward Israel since the 7th of October misfired and exploded in the parking lot of a Palestinian hospital. Hamas lied about the incident and reported that Israel had bombed a hospital. The New York Times was one of many left-wing media outlets to quickly run with Hamas's story, and they published under the headline, "Israeli strike kills hundreds in hospital." Though they updated their headline and reporting as evidence which contradicted Hamas's report became undeniable, one can't help but wonder, why did the New York Times take Hamas at their word? What is it about an organization like Hamas that strikes the New York Times as trustworthy? Is it that less than 2 weeks prior to the hospital parking lot explosion, they live-streamed the rape, torture, murder, and abduction of over 1,200 civilians? Is it the fact that Hamas also uses their own civilians as human shields? I suppose that shows they don't value Palestinian lives any more than Israeli lives. Does a no lives matter ethos resonate with the New York Times? Is it the way Hamas takes money sent to the Gaza Strip for humanitarian relief and uses it to finance their attacks? Or the way Hamas senior leadership embezzles aid money to live lavish lifestyles in Qatar? Why does the New York Times trust Hamas? It would seem the New York Times trust Hamas and will run with their account of what happened because they prefer the narrative which Hamas will provide. The New York Times wants to run the story that there are evil oppressor groups out there being evil oppressors, and there are innocent oppressed groups who can do no wrong. Advocacy for this narrative is more important to them than accuracy. The hypocrisy of abandoning a commitment to accuracy for the sake of this social justice advocacy is easy to see. Ostensibly, the New York Times acts like advocates because they don't want people to suffer because of their identity group. For example, someone shouldn't suffer injustice because they were born Palestinian. But the New York Times' disregard for the truth directly results in harm to people based on their race or religion, in this case Jews. It's a transparently inconsistent ideology, and this type of advocacy for social justice does tangible harm. Within hours of the media reporting that Israel had killed 500 when it bombed a hospital, protests against Israel accelerated around the world. This story was meant to enrage people against Israelis and that cast Israel's war against Hamas as morally equivalent to the barbarism of the 7th of October. The level of hostility, intimidation, and violence toward Jews in the Western world has risen to a level that hasn't been seen since World War II. There has been a 300% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in Austria, 240% rise in Germany, 609% increase in the UK, exponential increase in France as well, and an incident there where 80 Stars of David were painted on buildings in Paris. Rioters stormed an airport looking for Jews to attack in Russia. People have been tearing down posters of Hamas's hostages around the world. Vandalization, arson, and calls for genocide are happening daily. And all of this is worsened by media outlets like the New York Times, who push the evil group versus good group narrative, regardless of the facts. This disregard for journalistic standards and decency should not take anyone who has been paying attention by surprise. There's a pattern of the New York Times disregarding the facts and harming people for the sake of advancing the social justice, bad group versus good group narrative. In 2014, they promoted the narrative that Darren Wilson killed a black teenager because he was a racist. They made a local story, police officer kills attacker in self-defense, into a national story, which led to rioting, and in that process smeared Wilson as a racist across the country. What were the key facts in the stories they ran about Darren Wilson? They thought it was important for people to know he was raised in a mostly white neighborhood. How is that relevant to the fact he shot someone trying to take his gun from him? They repeated over and over, he is white, the man he shot was black and unarmed. Again, Is that as important as the fact that Michael Brown was trying to take his gun away from him while Wilson tried to detain him after Brown had just committed a strong-arm robbery? They made race the central issue when there was no warrant for it. They put building the narrative over educating their readers. Even after Wilson was acquitted and the DOJ could find no evidence of wrongdoing, the New York Times decided to keep the heat on Wilson. They wrote about where he lived in 2014. He just got married and he lives here now. You can almost hear the Times' hate-filled, half-wit readers say to themselves, Michael Brown will never get to get married, while his racist murderer does. Something should be done about that. What did they hope to accomplish by updating their morally deranged fellow travelers on where Wilson was living? How many cops have been killed by those who believe that narrative? The narrative that police are out murdering black people indiscriminately. And the lies which the New York Times and other left-wing media outlets promote. The idea that police are indiscriminately killing black men. The New York Times intentionally undermines trust in police and paints police as racist, not because of a fact pattern, but because that is what the guiding philosophy, good people versus bad people, at the New York Times demands. They promote the lie, and police are ambushed and murdered, just like what happened at the BLM protest in Dallas in 2016, and has happened several times since. It's another clear example of the New York Times putting narrative before facts, even if it means harming innocent people. In 2019, Nathan Phillips, a Native American man, approached a group of kids at the Lincoln Memorial while banging a drum and chanting. He got very close to one of the kids, a 16-year-old named Nicholas Sandmann, and continued to drum and chant in Sandmann's face. Sandmann smiled awkwardly while his friends laughed. The New York Times took a selectively edited video of this incident and created a story about how it was representative of the intimidation that minorities face. For the story, they interviewed the older man, Phillips, who said that he felt scared being surrounded by kids in MAGA hats, so he tried to leave, but Sandmann got in his face and prevented him from leaving. The New York Times pushed that version of events. What they didn't do was look at the full video of what happened. More egregiously, as far as standards of journalism is concerned, they did not get an account of the events from the 16-year-old or one of the other young alleged bullies. They didn't have the moral decency to stop and think, we're a national newspaper, and we are about to run a story that makes this minor look bad. We should make sure we have our facts right because this is going to hurt this kid if we publish. But harming minors of the bad race or political party is of no account to the Times, so they ran with the story. The result was the kid being slandered across the nation with national figures publicly comparing him to violent segregationists, fantasizing about punching him in the face and wishing death upon him and his family. All the moral stalwarts of the left were with full throat denouncing a minor because of his race. Because his race meant the New York Times was happy to run a story that made him look bad, with no concerns shown about getting the facts right. There's a clear pattern at the New York Times of recklessly disregarding the truth if they can twist a story to push the narrative du jour. Additionally, they don't care that these inaccuracies harm people, vulnerable people, like a 16-year-old kid, or a police officer in the midst of a climate where degenerates will target police for assassination based on the lie that is being pushed, or Jews in the midst of a global wave of anti-Semitism. At the New York Times, if someone belongs to the wrong group, they do not get objectivity or decency. Factual inaccuracies which harm people from the bad groups are okay. They put social justice above real justice, and social justice doesn't include justice for individuals. This moral callousness at the New York Times is representative of a more widespread callousness in American society toward the well-being of those who the dogma tell us are privileged or oppressors. The practice of victimizing innocent people and trying to deprive them of dignity and decency because of their identity group is not unique to the New York Times. It's a perspective and practice that has been perpetuated in schools and universities. For too many in our society, it is now okay for people from one group to suffer evil because their group deserved it. A shocking example of this trend is found by a Harvard CAPS Harris poll, which reveals that a majority of those under the age of 25, 51% of those surveyed, believe the killing of 1,200 Israeli civilians on 7 October was justified. Babies were beheaded, people were burned alive, women were raped, and children were abducted. The bodies of the dead were paraded through the streets of Gaza where they were spit upon and abused. Hamas recorded themselves raping and murdering, and then sent the videos of their evil deeds to the family members of the victims. It is some of the most barbaric material ever captured on video. Yet a majority of Americans under the age of 25 believe it was justified. Those surveyed knew the slain were civilians. It is in the language of the question, do you think the Hamas killing of 1,200 Israeli civilians was justified? One might argue that those surveyed didn't know just how grotesque the actions of Hamas was, but that would not justify them condoning it. It would not be okay if the murderers were quick deaths without all the added torture, humiliation, and wicked glee. Ignorance is no excuse. People are culpable for their ignorance if they were indifferent to the suffering of others because those others belong to an allegedly privileged or oppressor group. They are also culpable for trusting those who are known liars, indifferent to the harm done by their lies. People are responsible for managing their trust better than placing it in an organization like the New York Times, who is indifferent to the truth and the harm done to people by the perpetuation of falsehoods. The consequences of misplacing one's trust in this fashion is ignorance and becoming morally inconsistent, if not outright depraved. An example of this moral idiocy is found in the mindless chanting of, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." If one chants this, they are calling for the elimination of the Israeli state, which is effectively a death sentence for all the Jews in Israel. The river in question is the Jordan River, and the sea is the Mediterranean. This land they call for to be liberated includes the entirety of the Israeli state. Liberated is, of course, left speak for ethnically cleansed. If they want the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean to be a prosperous, free, multi-ethnic society, they would support Israel, where 20% of the population is Arabic, instead of Hamas, the organization that will not stop attempting genocide. Participating and promoting this slogan is proof of profound stupidity or moral duplicity. The education establishment has created a generation which repeats dogmas and mindless chants. They chant along because professors told them to, or because celebrities are behind this cause, or because it seems like the cool radical cause at the moment, or because those behind this cause insist that they have the moral high ground. But these are not a valid excuse for calling for genocide. Others are affected by this stupidity and evil. Being a vapid imbecile who has been trained to prefer dogma and chant over moral reasoning is not a valid excuse. The willingness of a majority of those under 25 to go along with the demonization of people should terrify everyone who opposes genocide. This is not hyperbole. In the same poll, where a majority of those under 25 said that the attacks on Israeli civilians was justified, 62% from the same age group believed the act was genocidal. So that means that somewhere between 13% and 51% of those under 25 believe the Hamas attack on Israeli civilians was genocidal and justified. More than 1 in 10 Zoomers think genocide can be justified. And group identity, not facts, is how they decide guilt. In 1940s Germany, how many people were held accountable for the Holocaust, yet didn't have as much information as Generation Z? How much more perverse and evil do we let the next generation become before decent people fight back against those organizations and people who promote the simplistic ideology of guilt by identity? This is just the beginning. If they are not stopped, the left wing will continue to energize animosity towards groups and justify the worst atrocities and brutalities. They are shaping this generation's values to not include individual dignity and universal human rights. It can be seen in the response to Hamas's terror attack, and it can be seen in the New York Times' disregard for the harm done by their subjugation of facts and truth to advocating for a narrative.